So I'm going to get pretty basic, just some things that we've been seeing this season, a lot of questions. We've been having, of course, not the most ideal year for tobacco with all the wet weather. You think about irrigation research, and really that's been, we get in a whole lot more problems with too much water on tobacco than we can with too little, and we definitely have had a lot of areas that have had too much this past year. But we talk about wet feet and tobacco. Of course, this was a lot of questions we were getting back about 2 weeks ago, and we've kind of worked past that now. But you think about tobacco being a tropical plant, grown more towards the equator and not really native to this part of the world, although we grow a lot of it around here. It doesn't like saturated soil conditions. So you're thinking about it isn't just drowned tobacco. If it goes underwater for more than about 24 hours, it's just going to die completely for sure, and no question about that. But just saturated soil conditions, we get a lot of root rot very quickly, a lot of root loss, a lot of feeder root loss. So it literally can't take up all the water that's there. It flops, and of course when a plant wilts or flops, as we call it sometimes, it can't transpire, it can't cool itself, and so the next thing you see is sun scald. So we've had a lot of that happen. That's kind of the physics behind what goes on. Even though you got plenty of water in the soil profile, a crop like tobacco just can't tolerate that kind of thing, and you get sun scald. You get some recovery typically, but we've seen some crops in past years and some this year too where they've gone down as many as 3 different times, and each time you see less and less recovery from that. So right now we're looking at, depending on soil type you're on, if you're on a better drained soil or if you got less rain, we're looking at most areas here in West Kentucky. You've had somewhere, and probably not counting last night's rainfall, we've had somewhere between about 12 and 19 inches or so. And so those kinds of rain, especially on those lesser well-drained soils, a lot less recovery. Okay, so we're looking at probably 5% to 50% losses, in some cases 60%. We're probably going to average a 20, maybe 25% reduction in our production. We're thinking because of that. That's right now. If it continues, it might increase some, but we're estimating possibly 20% losses because of this wet weather we've had here in the past month, since July the 1st. I'm talking about here. A lot of folks ask about any kind of magic solutions, magic sprays that may aid in recovery of this wilted tobacco, flop tobacco, sun-scalded tobacco. A lot of it will involve some kind of a calcium solution. And there may be some scientific basis to that. If you think about what calcium does to cell wall membranes and guard cells in the plant, and maybe prevention of a plant trying to wilt, but by the time you get back in the field to spray anything, it's already flopped. It's not going to do you any good. So we don't really have anything, and we have tested several things on wilted tobacco to increase recovery, and honestly, of the things that we've tested, we can't tell where we sprayed them or where we didn't spray them. And we can't see a difference between the untreated tobacco and the treated tobacco. So typically we don't know of anything that's going to help alleviate this situation as far as a spray we can come in over the top. It's really, doing nothing is going to be as good as trying to spray something. Now, a little bit about nutrient deficiencies with a year like this year where we were started out wet, especially if you set tobacco the last part of May there and on up into, again, late June where we got wet again. A lot of short-term nutrient deficiencies show up, and a lot of times we can have plenty of nutrients in the soil. It's just such a small root system, it just can't transport enough fast enough up into the plant. So you get these temporary deficiencies in a lot of cases. We see potassium, very common, probably the most common. Sometimes we see some phosphorus even, although we have some really elevated levels of phosphorus in these soils come out of row crop production. But we've seen that, a lot of potassium, in some cases even what looks like temporary nitrogen deficiency. Calcium, that's one thing we're looking at right now is people are looking at these type of deficiencies. They want to take a soil tissue sample and try to maybe follow what that deficiency says. Things change weekly in this crop. If you're taking a tissue sample, this week And then if we get drier conditions by next week, that may change a lot about what that plant's taking up. Some cases you may see calcium deficiency in the plant, and we're still way, very, very high levels in soil. It just hadn't taken up enough of it. This is an extreme case. Under extreme conditions, you may see calcium deficiency here that look kind of like a herbicide injury, like a dicamba, like a 2,4-D, but that's just calcium. That's just calcium deficiency. That's pretty rare to see that visual deficiency like that. But if you take tissue samples, it may show up calcium deficiency. We're looking at, if we see that in a tissue sample, we're going to go ahead and make a calcium application and see how much we can change that in the next tissue sample. Andrea Keeney, one of my students here, is working on that project. We're about halfway through soil sampling there, and we made a calcium application to see how much we can change those levels in tissue, and of course following that on through yield also. Boron, something that we see especially out in the western district. Typical symptoms there being leaf breakage, bud damage, shrunken buds, twisted buds, broken buds, but tender leaves that tend to pop off sometimes. We're looking at foliar boron applications, soil-applied boron applications there too. This is something that happens every year, but take a year like this year, even in some places you wouldn't expect to see so much boron deficiency, we may see some this year too. Potassium. I'm just going to touch on again a few topics. Really wanted to show you things in the field of some research we're doing this year in the field. One of them is a pretty large-scale potassium study that's sponsored by R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, where we're comparing two potassium sources. Those again being the major two potassium sources being potassium chloride and potassium sulfate. As you know, with tobacco, potassium sulfate is our major source of potassium we're using in tobacco. But if you look at the prices of that and some shortages we've seen, potassium sulfate, that is the 0050 that we typically use on tobacco. We are looking at some other sources like potassium chloride, but those have to be a fall application right now because of chloride in tobacco. We typically see some curing problems excuse me, on that. But we got a pretty large scale study where we're comparing different rates of both these sources, potassium chloride and potassium sulfate, both in spring applications. So we expect to see some elevated levels in cured leaf tissue for chloride and probably see some curing problems. But R.J. Reynolds is interested in a few other things they're seeing as far as leaf chemistry differences that may favor potassium chloride. And so we're doing some research with that. Again, right now, if you're going to use potassium chloride, it needs to be a fall application. If it's made prior to January 1st, after the 1st of January, it needs to be potassium sulfate. If you can get it done in the fall with potassium chloride, there's some pretty major cost savings. You're talking about potentially $400 a ton for 0060 muriate of potash compared to a spring application of potassium sulfate, which may be $850 a ton. It's a pretty good difference there in the price. Remember that about a third of our soil samples from tobacco fields here in Kentucky have a K index of over 450, which means we're not going to recommend additional potassium on those, although most of you probably will go ahead and put some out anyway, it seems like. But we did a lot of research with potash in the last 4 years, and really even our recommendations are pretty conservative. In other words, even though we may be recommending 150 pounds of potash, we can be hard-pressed to find a response to that in dark tobacco in some cases. So again, if you get a recommendation back from the university soil lab that says you need 0 potash, you can rest assured you've got plenty of potash in there, assuming you took a good soil sample, a good representative soil sample of that. If you get it done with a private lab, again, they're always going to be higher than our recommendations by probably 1/3 or so, because they're looking at a long-term soil building type of philosophy versus we're just looking at what that crop needs for this year, and then we expect you to soil test again for next year's tobacco crop. So again, that's the recommendations for dark tobacco. For potash, it'll go up to about 300 pounds of actual potassium per acre. For burley, it'll go up to about 400. It actually takes more potash on burley than we see on dark tobacco, but again, pay attention to your soil test recommendations. In a lot of cases, it may say 0 or very little you need. But based on what we've seen, this is kind of the expected response to potash, even with UK recommendations. If we're very high, obviously we're going to recommend 0 potash, and you wouldn't have any expected response to potassium if you were to add some. If we're in the high range of that K index of about 300 to 450, we're going to recommend up to 100 pounds. You wouldn't expect a response there either, even though we're recommending some potash there. Medium range, maybe. If you get up above about 160, it seems like in our data, we start to see some response. And if you get above that, 200 or better on the recommendation, then you would definitely expect to see a response to potash. But bottom line, follow recommendations, especially when it says 0. You're not going to need potash for that crop if you took a good soil test. This is some work we did at Murray State on a Grenada soil that did need high potash levels. This is 1 year there where this is all potassium sulfate, where we took the soil test recommendation 102 would be in the low range, recommended 290 pounds of potash in this case, and we looked at that rate, recommended rate there, and then half that, and then about 50% more than the recommendation. Either as a broadcast application like you would typically do before you set tobacco, or coming in there about a week after setting and making 2 bands beside each row there. So looking at, there's some, a lot of thoughts about, do we see response to increased potash above recommendations? And again, it can be pretty tough to see response to potash in a lot of cases in this. Bottom line is this is a paper Mitchell Richmond wrote, who will be speaking here in a little bit about another topic, about chemical topping for burley tobacco. Really, if you look at all the research, there's actually a 3-year study that we did out at Murray on a soil that did have some potash needs in that. In some years, we never saw a response, even though we were recommended. Soil test said we might need, 150 pounds or so there. But if you compare over the 3 years, this is the benefit of adding the potash based on soil test recommendations that, in our case, went from 190 to 290 pounds of K per acre. Made us about 165 pounds of potash, where we followed the recommendations. And on the grade index, this is all dark fired tobacco. On grade index, about a 6-point increase in quality. So you'd expect that, but not quite as clear cut as you would think it would be in terms of response to rates. We did get an overall response to potash, but again, that's a big cost savings there, just following the soil test recommendations there and not putting on too much, because even with the recommendations where we may say you need some, you might not see a response in some cases, but definitely want to follow those recommendations, but not exceed those recommendations. Sources, again, I've already mentioned this about the cost difference from a fall application. Potassium chloride, which is perfectly fine for tobacco to be used in the fall, but in the spring it needs to be potassium sulfate, and there it can be almost half the price per ton in some cases for the potassium chloride compared to potassium sulfate. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, we've had a lot of questions over the last, probably been 8 years about there is some liquid potassium sources that are being used, liquid phosphorus sources that are being used on tobacco and on some other crops as a replacement for dry fertilizer. Now, we got a lot of things that are being used as what I call additive treatments, where you've got your base fertility program with dry fertilizer there, and then you come in with maybe a foliar program and this kind of thing, but they're not trying to take the place of the base system with dry fertilizer. Some of these Again, there are liquid sources which can recommend small amounts of liquid, relatively speaking, compared to what the recommendation would say. In our case, that first year at Murray State, Grenada soil type called for 290 pounds of potash per acre. Went and got one of these potassium sources, and it said use 22 gallons of this potassium source, and that'll be equivalent to 290 pounds of potash. Well, if you look at this is just, you figure this up the same way you would figure up the rate for UAN or any kind of liquid. It's the weight per gallon and then the analysis you've got in there. This product had an NPK of 216, very low. It weighs about 9.4 pounds per gallon. So 1 gallon of that only contains about 0.2 of a pound of N, about 0.02 of a pound of phosphate, and less than 0.6 of a pound of K. So how in the world do you get 290 pounds of potash off 22 gallons? 22 gallons would only supply a little over 4 pounds of N, less than a half pound of phosphate, and about 12 pounds of K. So it's figured the same way. Don't fall for the equivalency. There we need dry fertilizer programs, or at least with these, figure them up based on what they are, what they're going to give you, and don't short yourself with this. There's no magic equivalency formula there that I know of that makes these equivalent to dry fertilizers. All right. Contact sucker control. Just briefly, as you know, we use a lot of contacts, a lot of fatty alcohols in dark tobacco, a lot of manual stalk rundown applications, and we typically have been using blended fatty alcohols. C6, C10, C12 fatty alcohols. These are your sucker pluckers, Fair 85, Royal Tac M. Those products like that are all blended fatty alcohols. There's been some recent shortages of those based on the plywood industry and a few other industries, actually going on for about the past 4 or 5 years. We've seen shortages of the blended fatty alcohols because of that, and also, of course, as you get a shortage, you get a price increase. Used to be you get a gallon of sucker plucker for $10. Now it may be $20 to get a gallon of sucker plucker. So the industry is going more to just a single C10 fatty alcohol. If you look at the blended fatty alcohols, most of them are mostly C10 anyway, decanol. And there's a lot more of just C10 than we have of this blend. And so you're going to see, I think, over time, more C10 fatty alcohol that doesn't have the blended, 3 or 4 different fatty alcohols in there. Things like Royal Tac and Antac. They're about the same price as the blend, but the rate's a little bit lower. So instead of using, say, a 4% solution, which is going to be 2 gallons per 50 gallons, with these like Antac, it'll be about 1.5 gallons. So a little bit of cost savings and probably a lot more availability over time with just a C10 fatty alcohol than the blended fatty alcohol. Again, sucker control program for dark tobacco. We like contacts, but again, if you look at this crop out here, a lot of blowover, a lot of lodging. When you get into something like that, we can't get this stuff down the stalk. Even though it takes a long time to get through there, you're better off just go ahead and spray MH on a lot of this tobacco there if it's that crooked. On dark tobacco, if you're in that situation, we like about 5 quarts per acre of the regular MH, the regular concentrate MH, no more than 1.5 gallons. If you got the high concentrate, it's going to be 3 to 3.5 quarts of that as a spray. And again, in this situation, it might be right at topping as opposed to 1 or 2 weeks after your last topping. We typically would like to come back about a week or 2 weeks after your last topping. In that case, you won't be able to see much damage from MH on dark tobacco. But these blown over crops, again, forget the oil and just go ahead and use the MH about like it was burley tobacco in some cases. Fatty alcohol on burley, again, typical standards, 1.5 gallons of regular MH and 0.5 gallon of Butylin or Prime Plus. Post and crop oil, just about to wind up here. We have had some issues this year. I always get questions about, you're afraid to add crop oil to post-herbicide. It's really, Sethoxidin, which is post, which we spray for grass control in tobacco. It is something that needs to have crop oil with it. to work its best. It's going to, you're going to see a big reduction in grass control if we don't use the crop oil with the Post. And the standard rate for crop oil has been a 1% solution of your spray volume. And so if you're spraying at say 25 gallons an acre, the rate would be 1 quart per acre for a standard crop oil. There's been some new high concentrate crop oils come about though that take a little bit lower rate. We've had a few problems with some burn on those. This is an example here. This is one called Between. That's a high surfactant oil concentrate. It's a crop oil, but it's got more of some of these surfactant content. It says on the label there some of the paraffins in the surfactant there. There's going to be half the rate. So instead of a quart per acre per 25 gallons, it's going to be a pint. So think about if you got a high concentrate oil versus a standard crop oil, the rate's going to be different. And if we use a standard rate of crop oil, there may be some burn in that. Typically, we hadn't seen even with a regular crop oil at the 1% solution, or the 1 quart per 25 gallons. We hadn't seen a problem with burn, but again, with these high concentrate ones, if we use more than that pint per acre, there could be. Okay, a little bit in closing about angular leaf spot. Something we see a lot out in the west, and there's a lot out there this year. Some out there on this side of the lakes too, but angular leaf spot's a bacterial disease that we see come in after wind damage and storms, which you had a lot of that this year. This is what it looks like. A lot of confusion about what it looks like. You see frog eye, you see target spot on tobacco, but angular leaf spot is going to be a dark spot that's got some corners to it. It's not going to be a circle like you see with frog eye or like you see with target spot. It's going to have some corners to it, some irregular shapes to it. Usually dark brown in there, the first specks you see, and they can kind of coalesce and come together. Our standard, really, the only thing we have to spray for it is going to be streptomycin. A lot of questions about Actigard for angular leaf spot. And we are testing Actigard right now with Emily Pfeiffer, our new tobacco pathologist. Actigard for angular leaf spot control in a trial she has here on the station where she's inoculated angular leaf spot on dark tobacco. But we're right in the midst of that. We haven't got the final results back yet. It'll be about another month probably before we know how good Actigard is. But a lot of it being sprayed, it is labeled for tobacco. It's been a blue mold treatment in the past. It's one of those things you would spray before blue mold gets there. It's going to turn on the plant's immune system more and help it fight off blue mold. She's got some pretty good data about activity against bacterial speck on certain vegetable crops too. And so thought we'd try it with tobacco. We're right in the midst of that. But a lot of growers are using quite a bit of Actigard. You can try it yourself, but we're right in the midst of seeing what that might do against angular leaf spot for dark tobacco. And we'll have better results hopefully in about a month from now.